The café carried the weight of silence beneath its dim, yellow lamps. Tables stood uneven, the smell of scorched beans heavy in the air. A stranger entered, coat worn, face plain, eyes unreadable. He was Harlan West, though no one here knew the truth. At the counter, Ezekiel Pratt, frail and bent, counted out his coins with trembling fingers. Derek Vaughn sneered, "That's barely worth the seat you take." Claudine Mercer's laugh followed thin as broken glass. Then came the sharper cut, spoken low enough to sting, "Sloan won't last long. Weak ones never do." The old man froze. The room went still. From his corner, Harlan sipped the bitter cup, the taste clinging like rust. Who was Sloan? Why did their scorn feel rehearsed like a game played too often? And why did the quiet man at the window watch without a word? The café breathed with weariness. Rusted iron chairs shrieked whenever someone moved their legs, scraping against a floor speckled with stains that had outlived seasons. The walls bore cracks paint, peeling in tired flakes as though even the room itself had stopped believing in repair. The air was steeped in thin coffee bitter, yet watery a scent that clung like defeat. Maribel Sloan moved among the tables with a tray pressed against her chest. Her hair clung damply to her skin. Sweat ran down her temple. She walked quickly, shoulders tense, lips pressed together as though holding back a sigh. Jonas Keaton stood behind the countercloth in hand, polishing a surface already clean. His silence wasn't diligence, it was escape. In the corner, Derek Vaughn leaned against the wall, thumbs dancing across the glow of his phone, a smirk frozen on his lips. He didn't see customers. He saw himself reflected in the black glass. Claudine Mercer sat on a stool by the register, turning her wrist to watch her painted nails catch the weak light. Her eyes, half closed, detached as though the world beyond her vanity didn't exist. The café was alive, but it pulsed with dissonance. Those who labored looked drained, those who shouldered responsibility ignored it, and those who watched like Jonas kept their silence. At the window, Harlan West observed unseen each detail pressing deeper into his mind. A porcelain cup, tilted milk spilling over its rim. Maribel's hand trembled as she reached for a cloth, words spilling faster than the liquid itself. "I'm so sorry." Her voice was soft, too soft to shield her from the response. The man she served scowled his palm, striking the table with a crack. The sound rippled across the room, louder than it should have been. Chairs shifted, eyes turned, then looked away. Maribel bowed her head lower, forcing a smile onto her lips as though kindness could erase humiliation. Her shoulders shrank beneath the weight of the stare she received. From the wall, Derek Vaughn lifted his eyes. He didn't step forward. He didn't help. His gaze was heavy with mockery, as if her stumble confirmed what he already believed weakness deserved contempt. The corner of his mouth twitched upward, not in amusement, but in disdain. Behind the counter, Jonas Keaton noticed. His hand paused on the cloth. For a moment, his eyes lingered on Maribel wide with something almost like pity. Yet, when Derek's gaze flicked toward him, Jonas looked away his silence, a shield he could not discard. Maribel steadied the cup, wiped the spill, and whispered another apology to the man whose anger still lingered on his tongue. She moved on quickly, but her faint smile remained a fragile armor against the indifference around her. A faint vibration broke the rhythm of clinking cups. Maribel slipped a hand into her apron, drawing out a phone worn thin at the edges. She glanced around, then pressed it close to her ear. The voice that answered was frail, strained through static. "The medicine. It's almost gone." Each word seemed to falter beneath its own weight. Maribel closed her eyes, her free hand tightening around the tray she carried. Her throat caught before she could reply. "I'll be home late, Mama. Don't worry. I'll take care of it." Her words were steadier than she felt. Her lashes glistened unshed tears, clinging but refusing release. She ended the call quickly, shoving the phone back into her apron, and pulled in a long breath to steady herself. Across the counter, Jonas Keaton had caught fragments of her hushed tone. His gaze flickered toward her, uncertain, almost sympathetic. But when Maribel looked his way, he turned back to his cloth scrubbing at invisible stains. His silence hung heavier than any words could have. Maribel pressed forward, shoulders straight, as though nothing had broken her stride. Yet the corners of her eyes betrayed her a sheen of sorrow that no practiced smile could hide. The café carried on indifferent while she bore the burden alone. Steam curled from the cup in Maribel's hand, the rich aroma promising a drink prepared with quiet care. She balanced it carefully, ready to carry it to the waiting table. The order had been hers alone to fulfill from grind to pour, each motion precise despite the rush pressing around her. Before she could take the first step, a hand cut across her path. Derek Vaughn, casual and sure, plucked the cup from the tray with a smirk. "Let me sign this one off." His tone was light, yet it carried the sharpness of theft made normal. Claudine Mercer laughed at his side, not loud, not kind, just enough to sting. "Smooth move, Derek. You've got the touch." Maribel's lips pressed together, teeth against her lower lip, the protest swallowed before it could rise. Her hands tightened on the empty tray, her shoulders shrinking inward. She did not fight him. She could not. Across the counter, Jonas Keaton lowered his gaze cloth, moving in circles without purpose. His silence was agreement, or at least a surrender. The cup left Maribel's hand, the credit stolen as easily as breath. And in the corner, Harlan West watched the bitterness of his untouched drink settling heavier on his tongue. The door chimed again and again, a metallic ring that stretched thinner each time. Customers filled the space, voices overlapping chairs, scraping against the tired floor. Heat thickened the smell of coffee, turning harsh, almost sour. Maribel moved through the crush with the speed born of necessity tray, balanced apron sticking to her back with sweat. Each table she reached offered another demand, another voice sharp with impatience. She bent, straightened, bent again, her body carrying the strain that others refused to share. Derek leaned against the counter phone, glowing in his hand. He didn't look up. He didn't lift a finger. Claudine, seated nearby, tipped her head lazily, nails glinting as she murmured, "I don't wash cups. Find someone else." The sink filled the smell of damp grounds rising. Jonas kept to the register, head lowered, eyes avoiding the chaos. He counted bills, wiped surfaces, already clean tasks that carried no weight. At the window, Harlan West sat with his cooling drink. He made no move to intervene, no sign of irritation. Only his eyes shifted, watching the rhythm of a room where effort and apathy collided, where injustice walked plainly in sight. Derek's hand hovered over the logbook pen, moving swiftly across the page. He signed his name beside hours he hadn't worked a ritual done without hesitation. The ink dried as though it belonged there, as though the lie itself had weight. A scrap of paper fluttered from the counter, caught by the faint draft. Harlan's gaze followed it to the floor. He stooped, picked it up, and read the scrawled numbers, figures that did not match ingredients gone missing in silence. His thumb pressed into the paper, folding it once, then again. Across the room, Claudine let out a short laugh. Who would notice? Who would care? Her tone was airy, almost sweet, but her eyes glittered. The words floated across the café, bitter as ash. Jonas paused mid-step, eyes caught on Derek's careless smirk. His mouth opened, then closed. The moment passed. He turned away, his back a shield against courage he could not hold. Maribel bent over a table rag in hand, cleaning crumbs that clung to the surface. She did not see, did not hear. Her world was narrowed to survival. Each movement meant only to keep pace. Harlan folded the paper once more, slipped it into his pocket. The silence of his observation was heavier than words. Maribel bent over a table rag, and hand hair sticking to her temple as she scrubbed at a stain that wouldn't lift. Behind her, a whisper slipped into the air like poison. Claudine Mercer leaned closer to Derek, lips curved in a smirk. "She looks like a cheap maid." The words weren't loud, yet sharp enough to cut across the room. Derek laughed, a coarse burst that carried farther than he intended, his voice echoing against the cracked walls. Maribel froze. Color rushed to her cheeks, not from heat, but from the sting of humiliation. Her hand stilled on the table grip, tightening around the cloth. At the next table, a pair of customers caught the remark. Their murmurs rose, uneasy, disapproving. Yet neither Derek nor Claudine cared. Their laughter filled the café, brittle and cruel. By the window, Harlan West pressed his cup onto the table with sudden force. The ceramic clinked hard against wood, a sound that cut through the laughter. His expression remained calm, but his silence grew heavier, almost audible. Maribel lowered her head, finished wiping the table, and walked away without a word. The cruelty had landed. The quiet endurance had been witnessed. The bell chimed again, softer this time. A young couple entered, hands intertwined, voices low with anticipation. They carried a brightness that seemed foreign in the café's weary air. Maribel approached, first, her smile genuine despite the sweat clinging to her brow. She welcomed them, offered menus, spoke in a tone that carried warmth into the dim light. Before they could settle, Derek intercepted, looming beside the table. His tone shifted the air. "This section's reserved. You'll have to order quick." His posture was sharp authority assumed without invitation. The couple exchanged a glance, discomfort flashing between them. At the register, Claudine scribbled numbers onto the slip, her pen gliding with practiced ease. The total rose higher than it should have. Her eyes flickered toward Derek, and his smirk answered back. The couple frowned as the bill reached their hands. Their smiles dimmed suspicion, cutting through their earlier joy. Without finishing their order, they pushed back their chairs. The woman shook her head, the man's hand tightening around hers. Together, they left. Maribel stood in silence, her attempt at kindness undone. Derek leaned back with satisfaction, Claudine's laugh trailing after them. The door closed, and with it went another chance for the café to breathe honestly. Noise swelled as the door burst open, a group of young men spilling inside. Their voices rose like a tide, chairs dragged across the floor, laughter breaking into shouts. Orders were shouted across the room: sandwiches, large coffees, extra sugar. Maribel hurried between them, tray tilting under the weight, her polite words drowned in their noise. Behind the counter, Derek tallied the bill. His pen moved quickly, too quickly, digits climbing far beyond the orders given. He slid the slip across the counter with a grin. One of the men frowned, brow furrowing as he counted. "That's not right." Claudine's reply came sharp. "If you can't pay, don't waste our time." Her smile was all teeth. Derek's laugh followed, low and mocking. "Kids like you never check anyway." Maribel interjected softly, apology spilling from her lips, her eyes wide with shame she hadn't earned. She reached for the slip, but Derek's hand cut her off. His glare silenced her. The group exchanged angry looks, muttering as they dug out their wallets. Their eyes flared with resentment, landing not on Derek but on the café itself. The room's energy shifted, customers stirred, whispers spread. Jonas Keaton stood motionless at the register. He saw, he knew, and still he did nothing. His silence was another fraud added to the bill. The slip lay on the counter, the ink still fresh, the numbers swollen beyond truth. Jonas Keaton's eyes fixed on it, his jaw tight. His lips parted, breath hitching, the words almost forming. "This isn't right." Yet the sentence died before it could leave him. His teeth pressed into his lip, swallowing courage whole. His hand shook as he reached for the paper. He folded it once, then again, the thin crackle sounding louder than it should. For a heartbeat he considered keeping it proof of what he knew. Then Derek's stare struck him, a hard, warning glare, sharp as iron. Jonas's hand froze, the crumpled slip sweating in his palm. He crushed it tighter, fingers whitening. The slip became nothing more than waste, tossed into the bin at his side. His chest rose, fell, a silent admission of defeat. Derek's smirk lingered, satisfied, without a word spoken. Jonas turned away, shoulders bowed, cloth in hand once more. He wiped at the register motions, empty, as if erasing not just stains, but the memory of his own silence. Around him, the café buzzed, unaware of the storm he had refused to call out. The door creaked, and in came Ezekiel Pratt once more, his steps dragging his coat too large for his frame. He made for the same corner seat, lowering himself with care as though the chair might betray him. In front of him rested a cup of thin coffee, steam, weak aroma diluted to near nothing. Derek Vaughn glanced over, irritation curling his lip. Not him again. His tone carried the exhaustion of disdain, as if kindness were more costly than beans. Beside him, Claudine Mercer tilted her head, her whisper carrying venom wrapped in silk. Waste of a seat. Why let him linger? Maribel Sloane approached softly, a napkin folded in her hand. She laid it beside the old man's cup, a gesture quiet and unannounced. He looked up, his eyes wet with gratitude, though he said nothing. She smiled, the smallest flicker of warmth in a room grown sharp with contempt. From his place by the window, Harlan West's gaze never left the scene. The faint tremor in Ezekiel's fingers, the cruelty in Derek's sneer, the contrast burned itself into his silence. The café carried on as before, but a fracture widened between the cruelty that spoke freely and the kindness that endured in hushed acts. Laughter rang out again, brittle and mocking. Derek leaned into Claudine, the two of them trading barbs at the old man's expense, voices low, yet sharp enough to slice the air. Their smiles carried no joy, only the satisfaction of stepping on what was already fragile. Across the room, Maribel's hands moved gently, placing fresh cups before another table. Her tone steady, her face open. Her kindness spread in silence, unspoken, but felt a counterweight to the venom across the counter. Customers noticed. Their eyes shifted between the two forces weighing the room without words. Jonas Keaton stood still, caught in the middle. When Maribel glanced his way, he turned his head, eyes darting down as if afraid of being seen, choosing a side. His silence stretched louder than speech. Harlan West remained in his seat, his form, still his expression unreadable. Yet the air around him seemed heavier, his presence absorbing every cruelty, every kindness, storing them like evidence. The café no longer felt like one place. It had split. On one side stood cruelty disguised as laughter, on the other, quiet resilience. And between them lay silence, thick and oppressive, daring to be broken. The storeroom door creaked open just enough for Derek Vaughn to slip inside. His hand reached for a sack of beans, heavier than it looked, the smell of roasted earth clinging to his shirt as he hauled it against his body. With a swift glance over his shoulder, he stuffed it into a canvas bag, pulling the strap tight. Claudine Mercer lingered near the entrance, her body angled just so her eyes scanning the room. She wasn't helping. She was guarding. Jonas Keaton passed by at that moment. His gaze caught the movement, the sharp tug of fabric, the deliberate concealment. For a breath, his steps faltered. Their eyes met Derek's hard with warning, Jonas's soft with unease. Jonas lowered his gaze, continuing as if blind. At the window, Harlan West noted every gesture. His stare didn't shift, his fingers tightening around the handle of his cooling cup. Not a word left his lips. He simply watched, storing the truth like a blade, waiting for its edge. Meanwhile, Maribel Sloane bent over the counter, unaware, folding napkins into neat squares. The café hummed around her, its noise shielding her from the theft occurring within its own walls. The imbalance grew invisible to most unavoidable to some. A woman at the counter waited for her change, the bill already steep for the coffee she'd received. Claudine Mercer tapped her pen against the register, eyes gleaming as she added another line. 1 spoon of sugar became 3/1 cost, became double. The receipt slid across the counter with a smile that carried no warmth. The customer frowned, comparing what she had ordered with what she had been charged. Her voice rose, uncertain but firm. "This isn't what I asked for." Claudine's reply came fast, laced with venom. "If you don't want it, leave. We don't have time to argue." Her tone turned heads, her contempt filling the room. Maribel stepped in quickly, her voice soft, soothing, trying to mend what had been broken. She apologized, offered to remake the drink, her eyes pleading for patience, but the damage was done. The woman's lips pressed tight, her glare shifting to the café itself. From his seat, Harlan West watched closely the pattern. Clear theft dressed as policy contempt, dressed as efficiency. His silence grew colder, his cup untouched. Claudine turned away without regret, nails tapping the counter like a victory drumbeat. Another customer lost another lie written into the café's ledger. The rush hadn't slowed. Plates stacked high, cups rattled against one another, crumbs scattered across the floor. Maribel Sloane's back ached with each step, a dull pain rising into her shoulders. Her hands trembled as she poured the stream of coffee, wavering before settling into the cup. Her apron buzzed with vibration. She slipped the phone against her ear as she balanced another tray. Her mother's voice wavered through the static. "The medicine's gone." I don't know how long." Maribel closed her eyes, cutting in softly. "I'll be home after my shift. Please, just wait for me." The tray tilted slightly in her grasp, steadied only by sheer will. Before she could breathe, Derek's voice cut through. "You're not finished. Take care of those tables now." He tossed another order slip onto the counter, not even glancing her way. The weight of his command landed heavier than the tray she carried. Jonas Keaton saw her stagger, the pallor of her face. His lips parted, but no sound emerged. His silence pressed down like another burden she had to carry alone. Harlan's gaze lingered on her hands, the shake of exhaustion hidden behind duty. The bitterness in his cup seemed to seep into the room itself, the cruelty growing more unbearable by the moment. Jonas Keaton's chest tightened as he watched Derek scrawl another false entry into the log. For once, his silence became unbearable. He stepped closer, each footfall heavier than the last. His lips parted the words, clumsy but brave. "You can't." The sentence was cut short. Derek's head snapped around, eyes narrowing to slits, his voice a venomous whisper. "Shut your mouth." The tone carried no volume, but the threat sank deep. Jonas froze, the tremor in his hands betraying him. His face drained of color, his shoulders slumped as though the fight had already been beaten out of him. Maribel Sloane noticed the exchange from across the room. Her gaze lingered on Jonas, timid, hopeful for a moment of courage. When he faltered, her eyes dimmed, her lips pressing into silence of her own. Around them, the café carried on, customers oblivious, yet the tension between two men thickened the air. Derek turned back to his task as though nothing had happened. his authority reaffirmed with nothing but a glance. Jonas stepped back, retreating into himself, the spark of protest smothered before it could ignite. The door opened to admit a figure unlike the rest, pressed suit-polished shoes briefcase in hand. The businessman's presence sharpened the edges of the room, his confidence marking him as someone accustomed to efficiency. He chose a table, set down his case, and folded his hands, waiting. Derek Vaughn glanced up once, then looked away, his voice dismissive. "He can wait." Claudine Mercer leaned over the counter, her tone dripping with disdain. Not important. Their indifference filled the air, as casual as it was cutting. Maribel Sloane caught sight of the man, her breath hitching at his expectant posture. She rushed forward, wiping her palms on her apron before offering a hurried apology. "I'll be with you right away." Her words were sincere, her movements brisk, but the damage had already been done. The businessman's brow furrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. He gathered his case, stood, and left without a word, his chair scraping loudly across the floor. The door closed with finality, and with it another chance for the café slipped away. Harlan West's gaze followed him out the silence, between sip and swallow growing colder. Profit bled with every careless act, yet the rot inside the café carried on unchecked. The air thickened heavy with heat and spilled grounds. Maribel Sloane pressed on tray, balanced against her aching arms. Sweat rolled down her temples, dripping onto her collar. Her hands shook as she poured the stream of coffee, wavering dangerously before it found the cup. Still, her lips curved upward, a smile, fragile but present. She set the cup down with care, murmuring a gentle thank you, as though kindness could erase exhaustion. The customer glanced at her, caught the strain beneath her mask, and offered a small nod of sympathy. It was a fleeting gesture, but it steadied her for a moment longer. At the counter, Derek ignored her. Claudine tapped her nails. Jonas kept his silence. None of them carried her weight. She bore it alone, her body trembling, yet her will refusing to break. By the window, Harlan West's eyes did not waver. He studied the tremor of her hands, the forced calm of her smile, the quiet bravery hidden in each step. The bitterness in his cup lingered, but it was no longer just the coffee. It was the taste of watching someone fight against collapse without help. Behind the counter, Derek leaned close to Claudine, his voice pitched low enough to seem secret, yet sharp enough to cut across the room. "What a fool." The words slid easily, venom masked as humor. Claudine covered her mouth, then released a laugh that cracked through the air, brittle and merciless. The sound carried farther than either of them cared to admit. Jonas Keaton heard every syllable. His face drained of color, the rag in his hand falling limp. The mockery wasn't directed at him yet, it landed inside him as though it had been. His eyes flicked toward Maribel Sloane, who bent over her work shoulders, hunched, unaware or unwilling to react. Her silence was a shield, fragile yet unbroken. In the corner, Harlan West's eyes darkened, his posture unchanged, but his gaze sharpened to steel. He made no move, no sound, but the air around him tightened. The cruelty on display was no longer hidden. It spread unchecked, seeping into the room like smoke from a slow fire. The laughter faded, but the echo remained more cutting than the words themselves. The café felt smaller, for it pressed inward by the weight of disdain. A slip of paper slid across the counter, figures bloated by lies. Jonas Keaton caught it, his hand trembling as though it burned him. He unfolded it once, then again, each digit screaming the truth he had buried too often. His chest tightened, the protest climbing into his throat. But courage faltered. His hand clenched instead, crushing the paper into a ball. His knuckles whitened, sweat dripping onto the counter. He held the proof of theft and deceit, then robbed it of power himself, tossing it into the trash with a hollow thud. Across the counter, Derek's smirk widened, satisfaction curling his lips. No words were needed. The silence of victory was enough. Jonas's eyes fell shame-carving lines across his face. He bent again to the register polishing, where no dirt lay, trying to erase the weakness in his own reflection. From his corner, Harlan West watched the exchange closely, his gaze steady, his silence deeper. Every moment was written into memory, each act of cowardice, each theft. He bore witness without interruption. By late afternoon, the café bulged with bodies. Chairs scraped against the floor, voices rose over one another, the air thick with steam and impatience. Orders piled, trays clattered, tension pressed against the walls. Derek Vaughn moved through it with irritation, his voice sharp. "Hurry up! Can't you see we're drowning here?" He barked commands he didn't follow, shoving blame onto others. Claudine leaned lazily against the counter nails, drumming, her gaze detached, refusing the simplest task. In the storm's center, Maribel Sloane carried the weight alone. Sweat dampened her apron, her steps faltered yet never stopped. She delivered, cleaned, poured, her body bending but not breaking, her face fixed with a smile too brittle to last. Jonas moved mechanically, avoiding eyes, his silence a shadow clinging to his every motion. He neither resisted nor supported, trapped in his own stillness. From his seat, Harlan West observed everything: the barked orders, the shirked duties, the quiet endurance. The bitterness in his cup was gone, yet the taste remained drawn now from the scene before him. The café no longer hummed with life. It suffocated with imbalance, each breath heavier than the last. The room buzzed with noise until Derek Vaughn raised his voice above it all. He leaned against the counter, arms wide, his grin spreading like a challenge. The boss. He never sets foot in this place. The words carried bold and defiant, spilling into every corner. Laughter followed his own, first sharp and booming, then Claudine Mercer's echo, high and cruel. The sound rippled through the café, a mockery meant not just for Maribel Sloane, but for anyone who believed work mattered or that someone above cared. Maribel bowed her head, the smile she wore cracked and gone. Her hands twisted in her apron, her shoulders shrinking beneath the ridicule. Jonas Keaton stood stiff behind the register, his lips pressed shut, his silence another kind of surrender. Customers shifted in their seats, the laughter unsettling, the arrogance staining the air. Yet no one spoke. The statement hung there, an insult not only to management unseen, but to the idea of order itself. From the corner, Harlan West lifted his cup, though he did not drink. His gaze lingered unreadable while the café sank deeper into contempt. The coffee in Harlan West's cup had long gone cold, a thin skin forming at its surface. He did not touch it. His eyes, once softened by patience, hardened to steel. He sat, unmoving, his presence heavy enough to quiet the breath around him, though the room had yet to notice. His fingers tapped against the wooden table, slow, deliberate, like a clock counting down to something inevitable. Each sound struck louder in his own silence than the laughter that filled the air. Derek's grin carried on, Claudine's whisper sharpened into more mockery. Maribel hunched lower, her body folding into itself. Jonas stood still, his throat dry, his chest tight. The café remained noisy, orders shouted, plates rattled, customers murmuring. Yet beneath it all was a thread, tightening, a line drawn by the stillness of one man. Harlan said nothing. He simply watched, his silence louder than any rebuke. The storm had not broken, but the air was charged, the weight of it pressing on every corner of the room. Those who laughed had no idea how near they stood to the edge. Derek planted himself at the center of the counter, laughter still echoing. His arms folded across his chest, his chin raised high. If the boss were here, I'd tell him straight to his face. The words rang out like a dare, soaked in arrogance. The café stilled, caught between disbelief and unease. Claudine tilted her head back, chuckling softly. Go on, Derek. Tell him. Her eyes gleamed, enjoying the theater of rebellion. Maribel Sloane's face drained of color. She gripped the tray at her side, her knuckles white, her lips parting as if to speak, but nothing came. She knew too well the cost of defiance. Jonas Keaton held his breath frozen. He felt the weight of what had just been said, the recklessness of it, yet he could not move. The words lay between them all like a match poised above dry tinder. In his corner, Harlan West's stillness deepened. He had heard every word. The moment Derek taunted authority, he had lit the fuse himself. The room hadn't realized yet, but the balance of silence and arrogance had shifted. What had been a boast would soon be reckoning. The scrape of wood against stone cut through the noise as Harlan West pushed his chair back. The sound was not loud, yet it cleaved the room. He stood tall and steady, his coat falling into place around him. A gray figure, unassuming until now, rose like a shadow turned solid. Every head turned. Conversations faltered. Forks paused halfway to lips. The air shifted, thickening as eyes locked onto the stranger who had been nothing more than background. Derek Vaughn leaned back, arms still crossed, but his grin stiffened. He raised his chin, his voice pitched with mockery. What? Got something to say, old man? The laugh that followed didn't carry the same weight it had moments before. Harlan said nothing yet. His presence alone unsettled the silence around him, heavier than Derek's bravado. The café, once noisy, now throbbed with tension, every heartbeat waiting for what would follow. The beginning had come. Harlan's gaze cut across the room, steady, unflinching. His voice, when it came, was quiet, yet carried with the weight of stone. Say it again. But this time, to the real owner. Silence dropped like a curtain. Laughter died in throats. The café froze, even the hum of the machines seemed to vanish. Claudine Mercer's jaw fell open disbelief, widening her eyes. Jonas Keaton's body went rigid, his hands gripping the edge of the counter until his knuckles blanched. Maribel Sloane's breath broke into sobs she could no longer hold. Tears streamed down her face, each one releasing the weight of humiliation endured for too long. Her hands covered her mouth, the truth both terrifying and liberating. Derek stood motionless, the smirk gone, his tongue caught between words and silence. The boast he had thrown into the air came back to choke him. The moment cracked open reality reshaping itself. The stranger was no stranger. He had been watching all along, and now his voice carried authority that none could contest. The revelation spread like fire. Murmurs surged through the crowd of customers' disbelief, mixing with awe. The owner here. All this time, their voices rose, overlapping, unable to contain the shock. Derek Vaughn's skin blanched, the blood draining from his face. His lips moved, fumbling for excuses, but the words tangled. The swagger that had held the room moments before shattered into stammering fragments. Claudine Mercer edged backward, her hands, shaking, her smile gone. She tried to slip into the shadow of the counter, but the truth clung to her, inescapable. Jonas Keaton stared at Harlan West as though turned to stone, the image of authority manifest before him. Every act of silence he had chosen now reflected back with unbearable clarity. Maribel collapsed into her hands, tears streaming freely. The weight she had carried alone, finally lifted, replaced by an overwhelming rush of vindication, fear, relief, all colliding. The café was no longer the same place. The air vibrated with the echo of revelation, the certainty that what had been hidden in shadow was now dragged into light. Harlan West stepped forward, his voice low but unshakable, every word cutting with precision. "You skimmed money from the till." His gaze fixed on Derek Vaughn, who flinched. "You turned customers away with contempt." A pause followed, heavy with memory, as murmurs spread among those who had witnessed the same. "You stole from the storeroom sacks of beans, hidden as though no one would notice." The weight of the truth pressed into the air, undeniable. "You mocked your co-workers, stripped them of dignity in front of strangers." Jonas Keaton shifted uneasily, shame coiling around him as he remembered his own silence. Finally, Harlan's tone darkened. "And worst of all, you insulted the very man who built this place, believing he would never hear you." His hand pressed flat against the counter, the sound like a gavel. The café stood still. Even those who had doubted now saw the ledger of sins written out in voice and memory. Derek's bravado cracked. Claudine Mercer shrank behind him. Justice had entered the room, and it bore Harlan's voice. The silence broke with Derek Vaughn's voice, ragged and desperate. "You don't understand our lives." His words scraped like stone, his throat raw with anger. His eyes reddened, his fists clenched at his sides. "We scrape for every dollar. We do what we must." Claudine Mercer trembled, her painted nails digging into her palm as though to hold herself together. She did not defend him, only clung to the hope of vanishing into the shadows. Jonas Keaton dropped his gaze, shoulders folding inward. He could not meet Harlan's eyes, could not bear the weight of what silence had made him complicit in. Harlan answered his tone, steady iron pressed into velvet. "Hardship is no excuse for cruelty." The words did not rise, but they carried farther than Derek's shout. They held finality, cutting off protest before it could grow. Derek's chest heaved, his face flushed with fury, but his defiance rang hollow against the quiet certainty of truth. The room had already turned, and he knew it. The weight of the moment pressed down until Maribel Sloane's voice broke through, trembling yet clear. "I thought of leaving this job." She faltered, her chest rising with a deep breath. "But my mother needs her medicine. I couldn't walk away." Her words silenced the room in a new way. The anger and noise fell into stillness, replaced by a fragile thread of empathy. Her hands twisted in her apron, her eyes wet, her voice cracking with each syllable. Jonas Keaton's eyes reddened. His lips parted, but no sound came. He turned his face away, ashamed of every moment he had stayed silent while she endured. Claudine looked down, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Even Derek's anger faltered, his body stiffening as guilt threaded through defiance. Harlan West's gaze held steady on Maribel longer than on anyone else. He did not interrupt, did not soften her truth. He let it stand a testimony stronger than his own accusations. Her confession cut deeper than his charges. The café breathed as one struck by a different kind of silence, the silence of understanding what had been hidden, endured, and carried alone. Jonas Keaton's chest heaved as though the silence itself had been suffocating him. His hands shook, but his voice when it came cut through the room. "I saw everything. I was afraid, but I'm not anymore." The words hung trembling in the air, yet they were heavier than any silence he had ever held. His eyes locked onto Harlan West, not downcast as before, but lifted steady. The shame that had pressed on him for weeks cracked open into something fragile but real courage. Derek Vaughn's breath grew shallow, his chest rising too quickly, fury and panic tangled in his gaze. Claudine Mercer trembled beside him, her nails digging into her palms, the arrogance drained from her face. Maribel Sloane lowered her head and gave the faintest nod. It was not approval, but recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that his words, late as they were, mattered. The café listened, every ear bent toward Jonas, the man who had always chosen silence until this moment. His voice was not grand, not eloquent, but it was enough to tilt the balance to show that cruelty did not command everyone. Harlan West's silence ended with judgment. His words were measured, neither loud nor hurried, yet final. "Derek Vaughn, you are finished here." The declaration struck like a hammer, stripping away what remained of Derek's swagger. His gaze shifted to Claudine Mercer. "You will face discipline for every deceit you wrote into this register." She bowed her head, her shoulders trembling, unable to meet his eyes. Then he turned to Jonas Keaton. "You failed in courage, but not in honesty. You will have the chance to choose better once." Jonas's throat worked relief and shame bound together. His nod was small, but it was real. Finally, Harlan's eyes softened as they fell on Maribel Sloane. "Your burden will not be yours alone anymore." Her lips parted, the first flicker of relief breaking through tears. Around them, customers' whispered voices rising, the murmur of justice witnessed. The café that had suffocated with imbalance now breathed with consequence. The café no longer carried the weight of scorn, but the hum of awakening. Customers leaned back in their chairs, their eyes fixed on the man who had revealed himself. Some nodded slow and deliberate, as though confirming to themselves that justice had indeed unfolded before them. Derek sat hollow, Claudine hunched into silence. Their presence no longer commanded the room. Instead, attention shifted to those who had endured. Maribel Sloane lifted her face toward Harlan West, her eyes wet but bright, searching for a steadiness she finally found. Jonas Keaton moved behind the countercloth in hand once more, but this time each motion carried purpose, a deliberate act of penance. His silence no longer felt like retreat, but resolve. The air changed. What had once been stale now seemed lighter, even fragile, as if the café itself had been scrubbed clean by what had transpired. Justice was not only spoken, but witnessed, and in witnessing the room became part of it. The tension that had gripped the café loosened, replaced by something fragile, almost tender. Maribel Sloane stood before Harlan West, her breath uneven. Tears streaked her cheeks, but her eyes were steady. Her voice came broken, caught in her throat. "Thank you, sir." The words were small, yet they carried the weight of every humiliation endured, every burden borne in silence. Harlan placed a firm hand on her shoulder, the gesture quiet but resolute. No speech was needed. The touch itself was acknowledgement, proof that her resilience had not gone unseen. Jonas Keaton allowed a faint smile to cross his lips, the first in hours, a silent sign that hope might still be possible. Claudine Mercer lowered her head, her gaze fixed on the floor. The arrogance that once gleamed in her eyes was gone, replaced by shame, heavy and unavoidable. The air softened. Conversations hushed into quiet murmurs. For the first time, the café felt still without suffocating. Gratitude, fragile and raw, lingered like a light that spread without sound. Harlan West's voice broke the hush, not sharp but steady, carrying a weight different from judgment. "Your mother's care will be covered. You won't face that alone again." Maribel's hands flew to her mouth, the sob escaping before she could stop it. Her knees weakened, yet she stood straighter as if the burden lifted in a single breath. He continued, "You will receive training, the tools you deserve. When you're ready, you'll hold more than trays, you'll hold authority." The promise was clear, no empty gesture. It was restoration offered in place of years of neglect. Tears flowed freely now. Maribel wept not from despair, but from release her body shaking as though her heart had been waiting for this moment to exhale. Jonas Keaton watched his chest tightening not with envy, but with admiration. For the first time he saw strength, rewarded kindness valued. The lesson etched itself into him as deeply as the shame of his silence. The café seemed lighter. What had been bitter air now carried the faintest trace of sweetness justice, not just spoken, but lived. Harlan West turned his gaze settling on Jonas Keaton. The silence grew thick again, but this time it pressed not with anger, but expectation. "Choose again," he said simply. Jonas's throat tightened. His palms sweated, his knees nearly buckled. Yet he lifted his head eyes meeting Harlan's without wavering. "I choose what's right." His voice cracked but did not falter. For a moment the café seemed to hold its breath. Harlan nodded once, a gesture that carried both authority and forgiveness. It was neither easy nor cheap, it was a chance singular and sharp. Jonas felt its weight, but also its grace. Maribel, still trembling from her own relief, managed a smile through tears. It was faint, but radiant, a sign that trust could be rebuilt. Claudine Mercer sobbed quietly. Her pride dissolved her hands, covering a face that no longer hid contempt, but regret. The room shifted again. Hope was no longer abstract, it had form, voice, and choice. Redemption stood visible, fragile yet real. From his corner, Ezekiel Pratt struggled to rise. His hands shook against the table, his frame frail, but his voice carried through the hush. "Thank you, sir." The words cracked soft as breath, yet they struck deeper than shouts ever could. The café stilled every sound, swallowed by his gratitude. Maribel Sloane moved quickly, steadying his arm, guiding him with gentleness that had cost her so much strength. His eyes shimmered, reflecting a lifetime of being overlooked, now finally seen. Harlan West inclined his head, a nod, simple but solemn, as if receiving testimony from the one whose voice mattered most. A single tear slipped down Ezekiel's cheek, trembling on his skin before falling. Harlan's voice broke the silence, calm yet resonant. "A cup of coffee can be bitter or sweet. It depends on who prepares it. People are no different." The words hung in the air, absorbed by every ear, every heart. The café froze, no murmurs, no scrape of chairs. Only the weight of meaning filled the space. Maribel's tears fell freely, her face buried in her hands. Jonas Keaton lowered his head, shame and hope mixing in silence. Claudine Mercer stood rigid, her tongue, still pride, dissolved. The room breathed as one, the truth settling into them like warmth after a storm. It was not just a verdict, but a mirror showing what they had been and what they could still choose to be. Harlan's last words lingered in the still air. "If you ever witness injustice, do not remain silent. Kindness survives only when it is carried forward." The café breathed with quiet, the bitter and the sweet entwined, leaving a taste that would not fade. The story did not end within these walls. It traveled with each listener, demanding to be remembered, demanding to be lived. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe so more voices of meaning may be shared.